Hi, everybody. Welcome to Inside Scoop with Sue. Today I'm here with Rich Karlgaard. I practiced this, still couldn't get it out. Rich Karlgaard, former publisher of Forbes and author of several books, including our focus of today's discussion, Late Bloomers, The Hidden Strengths of Learning and Succeeding at Your Own Pace. It's a groundbreaking exploration of what it means to be a late bloomer in a culture obsessed with SAT scores and early success, and how finding one's way later in life can be an advantage to long-term achievement and happiness. So that's a mouthful, but really true. And I can't wait to hear how you got here. So let's just start with what prompted you to write this book.
Well, first of all, Susan, thank you for having me on the show. And your magazine is doing wonderful work that benefits all. What prompted me to write this book on late bloomers is that I always thought of myself as a late bloomer, kind of in an amusing way. You know, it wasn't until my late 20s that I really was cognizant of becoming an adult as we define an adult, somebody who's, able to think ahead, delay gratification, plan, all of those things that we associate with being an adult. That didn't happen to me until I was about 27. And at age 25, just as sort of evidence of how slow I was to blossom, is that I still held down minimal jobs like security guard, dishwasher, things like that. All work is noble, but I was clearly underachieving. I remember one night when I was a security guard doing my rounds at night at a trucking yard. When I came to a chain link fence, I heard a dog barking from the other yard, and it was a trucking yard too. And I came face to face, separated only by a chain link fence, with a Doberman. And I thought, well, A, that was kind of scary. Thank God for the chain link fence. But number two, more devastating than that was that I came to the realization that my professional colleague was a dog. That was their security guard. And so I only began to really blossom in my late 20s. Now, that was always something amusing. Would I write a book about it? Would I tell my kids about it? But what really prompted me to get off my butt and write the book was what was happening around me where I live. I live in a very high performance area in Northern California. I live 5 miles from Stanford University. If you drew a triangle and the points to the triangle where I live points to the triangle inside of which my home would be, you have Apple's headquarters, Google's headquarters, and Stanford University. High performance. And the public high schools in Palo Alto, as you can imagine, in Stanford's shadow, are very, very high performance. Well, there's a problem with that, is that there were in the 2014-2015 school year, there were a number of suicides in Palo Alto's high schools. In fact, a writer for Atlantic Monthly named Hannah Rosen came out and wrote a piece about it called The Silicon Valley Suicides. And the suicides were tip of the iceberg. The part that you didn't see were dozens and dozens and dozens of kids who were hospitalized for suicidal thoughts. And when Hannah Rosen and others talked to the parents and talked to the kids were basically, they weren't, they had never been clinically diagnosed. They weren't necessarily bipolar. They weren't into drugs. They were simply ashamed of the fact they were getting only 3.4s in their GPAs. And I thought, what the hell have we done to kids that we would inflict that kind of shame on them because they weren't early blooming superstars? So that's why I wrote the book.
Or even superstars. Like, there are just a lot of regular people in the world, and we should celebrate regular people too.
Well, everybody has gifts. And I'm a big fan of the Olympics. What I love about the Olympics, and we just watched the Tokyo Summer Olympics, when national teams march in, you see the whole wide variety of human skills. Good Lord, I sound like ABC Wide World of Sports back in the day. But you see weightlifters, you see shot putters, you see cocky sprinters on the balls of their feet. You see female gymnasts that are 4'8" and weigh 85 pounds. You see, skinny marathon runners. To me, it's all wonderful because the human gifts are on such a wide spectrum. And when you have a venue like the Olympics, there are enough sports where they celebrate all these different gifts and aspirations. But for kids who aspire to go to college today, it gets narrower and narrower and narrower. It's how well you do in advanced placement courses, and it's how well you do on standardized tests. And the whole process of doing really well, so that when you sit down at age 16 or 17 to take the SAT, if you haven't practiced, if you haven't spent, thousands of dollars on tutors, at that point, you're going to be behind. So it's really skews thing in a very narrow direction. I'm not against early blooming. I'm against forced early blooming for kids who are shoved onto a conveyor belt that is leading them not toward their gifts and aspirations, but where they're competing on an unfair playing field because they don't really care, and they may not have, like 800 math SAT gifts.
So when you were done researching and writing your book, what was your big aha moment takeaway?
Well, that we do. It was reinforced to me, something I think that I've always felt on a deep level, that we all have, that the vast majority of us, those of us who are fortunate enough to be healthy and of reasonably sound mind, the majority of us have gifts that the society may not recognize, and we may not even know it ourselves. And rather than opening up the envelope and really trying to figure out for our children, what might they be good at? Where could they bloom? Because I was really kind of surprised when I started the research for the book Late Bloomers, and I spent 3 years researching this before I even put a word to the word processor, was that there's no definition of late blooming. So I decided to make one up. And that is, late blooming occurs when your deepest passions, going beyond passion to a sense of mission, a passion that you're willing to sacrifice for, that kind of passion meets up with something that you are natively gifted at that maybe you didn't know. And if you can arrive at that intersection of sense of mission and sense of your giftedness in whatever area, then you can bloom. And so I think, I would like to see a school environment for parents to think about, how do we get our children to find that intersection where the intersection of their gifts, but also their own authentic sense of passion. And again, not sort of a fleeting passion. Gee, I was passionate about that pizza I had last night or that movie I watched, but a passion that you're willing to get up early in the morning and work hard and sacrifice for. Because I think that's what we all want for ourselves. It's what we want for our children. It's what we want for society. As you pointed out, and I agree with you 100% when we were talking before this, we went live, life is not a zero-sum game. Society is not a zero-sum game. Everybody can thrive, but they can thrive when they are at that intersection of their gifts and their deepest sense of passion.
So we grew up in a world where there was kind of a perception of a straight path or climbing a ladder. And at least watching my kids, that's an antiquated concept. So, but I don't know if we've changed our parenting or our educational system to reflect what's happening afterwards. What do you think about that?
I think that is absolutely true. I think COVID is a game changer, though. Now, when I first thought of writing this book, it was 2014 or 2015. I spent years researching it and about 18 months writing it. It came out in April 2019, pre-COVID. And I think what COVID has done, particularly what it's done for schools and careers, is caused, we're going through the great reassessment. But we all like to make lemonade out of lemons. COVID is it's a planet-sized lemon that splatted on planet Earth, and we're all scrambling around. And it's not, it's a negative event, but we can make a positive out of it. I think if we reassess school and we reassess where we want to go in our career, a lot of people are doing that, and they're doing it in ways formal and informal. Homeschooling, you may agree with homeschooling, you may not. But it's interesting that that there's a lot of growth among, in the homeschooling sector. Another place where I think this is representative of this rethink is a lot of employers are saying, the degree isn't as important. We want a certificate, some kind of certificate of knowledge that you really can do the things you say you can do as validated by somebody else, and it doesn't need to be a degree. And then we want some sort of evidence that you can stick to it. And maybe that evidence isn't spending $250,000 or $300,000 for a private 4-year education. That's kind of a lot of money to provide evidence that you're smart and you work hard, right? And maybe drink heavily at, on the weekends. But so I think there's a big rethink going on here. And if we all rethink that, then maybe COVID was a blessing. Doesn't feel like a blessing now, but maybe, but it's up to us to make this unexpected, unwanted event and turn it for the good. And I think in the field of late blooming, whether we're talking about school or we're talking about work, there's some evidence that that's happening.
Even in schools.
Yep.
That's great.
Well, not the formal education system, K through 12, maybe not. It depends, it depends where you are. It depends on your school district. I mean, COVID has been just about the most inequitable, public health policy that's ever happened, because the poor people and people that have been disenfranchised anyway tend to be those where they're in crappy public school districts. And so we need change there. But what's happening is that parents are saying, wait a minute here. And I think that's probably a good thing. So I'm always optimistic. So you have to take with a grain of salt anytime I express optimistic sentiments. But I think that COVID has forced a big rethink in the workplace and in school. In the workplace, what do we know? Well, we know employers are scared to death they're going to lose their good people, because good people are looking around right now. This whole work from home or hybrid work environment, whatever it turns out to be, at least for white collar people, it's caused a lot of people to think, do I want to work for this company? Maybe I'm now free to think, maybe I'm now free to say that my boss is a moron who does have a zero-sum attitude. And, my gain and our team's gain is that jerk's loss. Some people might be coming to that conclusion. Some people might think that they're in the wrong profession to begin with. So I think we're going through a big reassessment right now. And as I say, my optimistic self says, well, let's take this planet-sized lemon that's squashed on us and see if, like 5 years from now, it caused a lot of change from formal education to informal education to how we approach our careers in a positive way.
I mean, I think for sure now is a time for reflection. There's no getting around it. We're all struggling. There's, if you look at anxiety as the barometer of how we're feeling, then we're all struggling right now. So here's like a conversation that I always think is so interesting. We kind of covet the story about the child prodigy, who is the opposite of what you're talking about. They are arriving at some like unbelievable level before they've even lived enough years to actually have acquired, like having the 10,000 hours of practice, whatever it takes to be skilled. So we covet that. And then we leave all these other kids kind of like thinking that's the norm. So I wonder, is it even good for the kid who's the prodigy to be holding them up like that? What's the downside of that? And what's the downside for all the other kids?
Well, I think it's a double-edged sword. I purposely did not take on the tiger mom philosophy, because who am I to say that it won't work if in fact it works for some kids and it works for some families? And I'm very acutely aware of the history of all this, of a lot of immigrants to the United States, particularly first and second generation immigrants, put a lot of pressure on their kids to succeed in standard ways, academic ways, and so on, because it's a path out of maybe poverty, it's a path into acceptance, and so on and so on. That's really hard to criticize. I'm not even going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. I would say to parents who are going down the sort of the tiger parent route, if it works, I'm the first, God bless you. How wonderful that is. But really, stay in conversation with your children all the time, because if you're beginning to hear or even think that you're hearing some of the things that these kids at the Palo Alto high schools were telling Hannah Rosen and some of the psychiatrists and psychologists, that they felt like utter crap and worthless because they were only 3.4 students. You don't want to find out about that when it's too late. And so I think that it's pushing your kids. I mean, because we can make a mistake in the opposite direction and not do that at all, and that has consequences too. So I think what it reinforces is that we really have to be in conversation with our kids, not as our kids' buddies, as our kids' parents, and coaches and mentors and amateur psychologists and priests and rabbis and all of that kind of stuff. But we really need to kind of calibrate. Any really good coach, whether it's in sports or the business world or in music and the arts, really the good, what separates the good ones from the mediocre ones is that they understand individually who responds to pressure and challenges, who responds better with a hug and reinforcement, because it is different. So I would say, for early bloomers who are thriving by being early bloomers, and their parents who are developing thriving, healthy kids with that philosophy, more power to you. It's just that it doesn't work for everybody. And for some, it will backfire horribly.
That's our challenge as parents, right? Like even in your own house, each kid isn't going to respond to the same interaction. So yeah, good luck to all of us. Okay, so this linear path doesn't seem to be there anymore. We are reinventing ourselves frequently in a lifetime. So is a gap year, if you're finishing high school, are you really ready to go to college? Is this, again, not an everyone yes or an everyone no, but what do you think about a gap year?
I'm a huge proponent of gap years, and gap years can take many forms. Let's go to first principles and discuss why a gap year might make sense. There's been a lot of recent research. In fact, there was a New York Times cover story. It happened about 2 years before I decided that I wanted to write this book, Late Bloomers. This is one of the sort of signs, that there is something in the culture that, where a book on late bloomers might be a useful addition. And that is that we're accustomed to thinking of, kids are pre-adolescent, then they're adolescents and teens, and then they become adults at 18 or 21 or something like that. And the more recent thinking is that there's this age range from, let's call it 18 to 25, where young people are in another world, not teens and not quite adults. And people who insure drivers already know this, because your insurance goes down at age 25, your insurance costs. And, from 21 to 25, particularly if you're a male, you're a dangerous driver statistically. And it simply means that you don't really think things through. You're impulsive. You're not thinking about tomorrow, all the things that are a hallmark of a fully functioning adult. So, why wouldn't we want to build in a little cushion for maturity so that our kids are entering, let's say, college at 20 instead of 18, or they're entering the adult world after a 4-year degree at 24 or 25 rather than 22, because they're going to be that much more mature. Now, the key with a gap year is not a parent-funded vacation at all. It can take many forms. I think going out, taking 2 years off and doing something physically hard, particularly if you're one of those white collar, kind of pampered in a physical way, not in an academic way, but, your typical upper middle class suburban kid, most of them have not known hunger or hardship or anything like that. And maybe a little brush with that is not a bad thing. The Church of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, I'm not a Mormon, but I'm a big fan of their 2-year missions, because they go out there generally after their sophomore year in college, and then they come back as juniors, 2 years older, wiser, and kind of tougher Because most people, I was friends with the late Harvard business school professor Clayton Christensen, who was Mormon. And in fact, he's on the board of directors of the Church of the Latter-day Saints. He sadly passed away at the beginning of 2020. Wonderful man. He was in Korea, South Korea, during his mission. Did he like it? No, he didn't like it at all. It was hard. Another thing that's hard, Israel, Singapore, Switzerland, Sweden. I guess if you're, the countries that have mandatory military service. It's a pretty good thing, particularly for young men. I mean, who are society's troublemakers? Let's just be honest about this. Let's not be politically correct about it. It is young men who are, misdirected, don't have a sense of direction at all, and get into trouble. And so the countries with mandatory military service, if you're adamantly opposed to the military, let's just have a civil service substitute for it. But it's the same principle. Go out there and, maybe go out there and mix with different social classes, different races within your country toward a common mission and work hard. And so, one of my colleagues in Singapore was a young man with no direction. By his own telling, he was in the Singapore military and he came out completely changed. So these are ways to build in gap years. Gap years of 1 to 2 years are really good, so long as the parent isn't writing checks, so the kid can go out and have an extended party.
All right, last question.
Yep.
So tell us, if we are the parent of a child who is not the first to the finish line, what's the silver lining about those kids?
Well, the silver lining is, let's take kids growing up today with all the medical advances and so on. If they stay, if they get their annual physical and don't do self-destructive things, there's a good chance those kids will live to be, well into their 90s. With outliers even living more. But let's say they will be healthy and functional and able to, even hold down a white-collar job well into their 80s. I don't think that's a stretch. So when you look at the ratio, how far along in such a life is an 18-year-old, it's not that far. There is time. There's not time to waste, but there's time to not get anxious about the fact that, okay, in this the first slalom in this ski race of life, I didn't get to the first gate, when others were expecting me to get to the gate. That may be because I have the wrong pair of skis on. It may be that I shouldn't be in a ski race at all. I should be in some other activity that more properly measures my own passions and skills. So I think there's time. I think that by the time you get into your 30s, though, I think that the 20s should not be wasted. They should not be wasted. If that first great job at Goldman Sachs or Google didn't materialize, don't sweat it. Go out and do some hard things. Go out and do some hard physical things, some challenging things that will kind of broaden your vision, make you see the world a little bit differently, but give you real confidence. The 20s is a really critical time, I think, to absolve oneself of destructive habits. I mean, maybe one went to college and hung out with the kids who drank too much during the weekend and at other times. That's a good habit to get rid of, in your 20s. You don't want that one to get worse in your 20s. It's just going to delay. There are things like that. It's a time to work on, I think the path to confidence. We want to create healthy, confident people. And the path to health and confidence, we know what creates good physical health, and psychological health is a little trickier, but I think it's the avoidance of self-destructive habits. It's doing things where you can begin to move the wheel and get some early wins and be able to build confidence. And that's, usually overcoming some kind of thing that at the beginning you said, that was difficult. And the reason there's such satisfaction, why it builds confidence when one does those things, is because it was difficult. So don't sweat an 18-year-old who's not going off to Harvard, or is a 22-year-old who didn't get the $250,000 offer from Google. This is the time to really build a human being, and fully functioning adult human being.
Well, that's a great way to end. This is the time to build a fully functioning human being. Rich Karlgaard, thanks so much for being here with us today.
It was a delight, Susan. Thanks for having me.